The hum of the environmental control system was a constant, low thrum, a mechanical heartbeat within the granite shell of the archive. Blake moved with deliberate precision through the towering aisles, each step measured, each breath a conscious intake of air filtered free of the world's particulate chaos. The facility, a repurposed Cold War-era storage vault, was carved deep into the base of the Jagged Tooth range, accessible only by a winding, treacherous mountain pass. For Blake, this isolation was not a burden but a sanctuary, a necessary barrier between the fragile order they maintained and the unpredictable sprawl of external existence. Blake's domain was information, meticulously catalogued and preserved. Their hands, calloused not from rough labor but from the constant, careful handling of delicate paper, moved with the practiced grace of a surgeon. Today's task involved a newly acquired collection, the estate of a reclusive cartographer whose personal effects had filled nearly a dozen crates. The initial inventory had been a nightmare of disorganization, a stark contrast to Blake's own exacting standards. They reached section Gamma 7, a colder, deeper recess where the crates were temporarily stored. The air here carried a faint, coppery tang beneath the omnipresent scent of aged paper and dust. Blake pulled on fresh nitrile gloves, the thin material a second skin against contamination. Each crate was identical, reinforced steel, sealed with industrial-grade clamps. He consulted their digital manifest, cross-referencing the crate number. They selected crate 7B, noted as containing miscellaneous personal effects, uncatalogued. The clamps hissed as Blake released them, the sound amplified in the quiet. They lifted the heavy lid, revealing a jumble of objects swathed in yellowed tissue paper, compasses with tarnished brass casings, dried inkwells, a collection of brittle parchment maps depicting forgotten coastlines. He methodically began to remove the items, placing them into a sterile tray for preliminary assessment. Each object was logged, its condition noted, its potential historical value briefly considered before being set aside for deeper analysis. Midway through the crate, beneath a rolled-up tapestry of faded silk and a small, leaded box containing a broken sextant, Blake's gloved fingers brushed against something unexpected. It was not the familiar texture of wood, metal, or paper. This surface was cool, almost slick, yet entirely non-reflective, seeming to absorb the harsh LED light of the archive rather than scatter it. He paused, their movements arrested by this subtle anomaly. They carefully excavated the surrounding items until the object was fully revealed. It was a folio, roughly the size of a large atlas, but its proportions were subtly off, slightly asymmetrical in a way that defied conventional binding. There were no visible seams, no stitched spine, no clear indication of how its pages might be opened. The cover material was a uniform, matte black, devoid of any discernible grain or texture. It felt simultaneously impossibly light and profoundly heavy in Blake's grasp, a paradoxical sensation that caused a fleeting moment of cognitive dissonance. His internal monologue, usually a precise stream of procedural directives, faltered. This object did not fit. It possessed no identifying marks, no labels, no stamps of origin. Its edges were sharp, almost unnaturally so, yet they did not feel abrasive. Blake ran a gloved thumb over its surface, and for an instant, a faint tremor, not in the object itself but within his own perception, rippled through their vision. The precise lines of the shelving units seemed to waver, the distant hum of the ventilation system briefly dissolving into a high, thin whine before snapping back to its steady drone. A prickle of unease, unfamiliar and unwelcome, began to spread across Blake's scalp. They were accustomed to the predictable, the categorizable. This folio was an affront to their meticulous world. His determination, usually channeled into overcoming logistical challenges, now faced a different kind of resistance, an existential one. They placed the folio onto the sterile tray, setting it apart from the other items. As their hands withdrew, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth radiated from the black material, a sensation that lingered on their fingertips long after contact ceased. Blake stared at the object, their brow furrowed. The air in the archive suddenly felt thicker, heavier, as if the very space around the folio had absorbed some intangible quality. His gaze drifted to the row of surveillance cameras mounted high on the walls, their red indicator lights blinking rhythmically, silent witnesses to this quiet intrusion. For the first time in years, the archive felt less like a sanctuary and more like a sealed chamber, and Blake, inexplicably, felt observed. The meticulous order of their world had just admitted a fundamental, unsettling question mark. The clamps hissed, a metallic exhalation in the hushed archive as Blake released them. Beneath the mundane, something else lay nestled. Blake's fingers brushed against a small, dense object. It was perfectly smooth on one side, cool and unyielding, like polished obsidian, yet it absorbed light rather than reflected it. On its reverse, a single, swirling indentation seemed to writhe just at the edge of perception, an impossible spiral that never quite resolved itself. Blake picked it up. It fit snugly in their palm, heavier than its size suggested, radiating an unnatural cold that prickled their skin. They turned it over and over, trying to find a scene, an inscription, anything familiar. There was nothing. Just the featureless, light-absorbing surface and the dizzying, impossible swirl. The other objects in the container, once intriguing, now seemed utterly irrelevant. Blake carefully set the maps and compasses aside, their focus narrowed entirely on the strange stone. They carried it to their workstation, a solid oak desk cluttered with reference books and cataloging tools. The archive's usual quiet, a comforting blanket, now felt like a suffocating pressure. 4 hours, Blake cross-referenced. They searched databases for unusual geological formations, obscure ancient artifacts, forgotten cultic relics. The stone defied every category. Its material composition felt alien, unlike any known mineral. The swirling pattern on its surface wasn't a carving, more like an intrinsic part of its being, a frozen vortex. Blake felt a growing, irrational certainty that looking at it for too long altered something in their own vision, leaving faint, shimmering afterimages in their peripheral sight. Still at it? The voice of a colleague, the section supervisor, startled Blake. They hadn't heard the supervisor approach. That old box has you captivated. Find anything valuable? Blake instinctively shielded the stone with their hand, a possessive, almost defensive gesture. Just an interesting piece. Unusual. The supervisor, a pragmatic individual with tired eyes, peered over Blake's shoulder. Looks like a paperweight. Or a very smooth rock. Don't let it distract you too much, we have the North Wing inventory by Friday. They lingered for a moment, a frown creasing their brow, then moved on, leaving Blake feeling exposed and oddly guilty. The interaction solidified a strange isolation. Blake found themselves working later and later, the archive emptying, leaving them alone with the stone. The humming sensation grew more pronounced in the silence, a low thrum that vibrated deep within their bones. They began to notice subtle shifts in their surroundings, the fluorescent lights above seeming to flicker in patterns that weren't random, the air growing thick with an unspoken presence. It wasn't a symbol, but a series of minute, interconnected lines, like a microscopic topographical map. They retrieved a powerful magnifying glass, adjusting the lamp. The lines resolved into a familiar yet unnerving landscape, a jagged, winding path flanked by colossal, impassable peaks. It was unmistakably a mountain pass. They remembered seeing a similar depiction on one of the brittle parchment maps from the container. Frantically, they sifted through the discarded maps. And etched faintly beside the pass on the map, a symbol Blake had dismissed earlier as a stylized spiral, now seemed to perfectly mirror the swirling indentation on the stone. The stone wasn't just from the mountain pass, it was the mountain pass, in some impossible, condensed form. They ran their fingers along its interior, feeling for any hidden compartments. Near the bottom, beneath a false floor that blended seamlessly with the aged wood, their fingers snagged on something. They pried it open, revealing a slim, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age, filled with cramped, archaic script. The journal wasn't a catalog, nor a history. It was a personal account, fragmented and increasingly erratic. The entries, spanning decades, spoke of the stone, referring to it as the eye of the passage. The author, a nameless caretaker, described a slow, insidious change in their perception, a blurring of reality. The world thins, one entry read, and the mountain pass bleeds into all things. The humming was no longer subliminal, it was a low, resonant thrum that filled their head, drowning out all other sound. The mountain pass, depicted on the map and etched into the stone, felt less like a distant location and more like an imminent presence, a vast, silent maw opening just beyond their comprehension. Blake clutched the journal, their mind reeling, caught between the terrifying implications of the caretaker's words and the horrifying possibility that their own sanity was already beginning to unravel. Nagging doubt that eroded Blake's confidence. They began to question their own memories, small details of their routine, the exact placement of files, the precise wording of instructions. Had the archive always been this silent? Had the fluorescent lights always hummed with such an insistent drone? His determination to understand the box now mingled with a desperate need to understand the shifting landscape of their own sanity. The isolation deepened. Blake started taking meals alone, avoiding the break room, where the mundane chatter of colleagues felt jarring, unreal. They spent their evenings in the archive, long after everyone else had left, bathed in the cool, blue light of the task lamp, fixated on the enigmatic box. The recursive pattern became clearer, more insistent. It was not merely a design, it was a language, a silent, visual dialect that spoke of impossible dimensions and non-Euclidean spaces. He realized, with a chilling certainty, that the box was not merely an object to be catalogued. It was a catalyst. It was slowly, meticulously, dismantling the established architecture of Blake's reality. And he, despite the growing terror, could not look away. The truth, however unsettling, held an irresistible allure. The direct manifestations began subtly, then with terrifying intensity. Blake had been tracing the shifting patterns on the box for hours, fingers hovering inches above its surface, when a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the wood. It was not a vibration, but a shift in its inherent stillness, as if the material itself was breathing. He leaned closer, their breath held. Suddenly, a seam appeared on the box. It was as if the box was momentarily revealing its true, alien geometry, a glimpse into its impossible interior. A sound, not heard but felt, resonated in his skull, a low, resonant thrum, like the universe itself vibrating on an unheard frequency. The air in the archive grew heavy, charged with an unknown energy. The box responded. It was not a physical form, but an impression, a shadow cast from a dimension beyond human comprehension. It had no discernible features, no limbs, no head, yet Blake felt an undeniable, crushing presence, an intelligence that dwarfed all human understanding. This was the cosmic horror. It was not a monster with teeth and claws, but a fundamental truth, a reality that had always existed. Veiled by the comforting illusions of human perception. The box was not an artifact that contained the horror, it was an artifact that revealed it, by stripping away the layers of his conditioned reality. Blake felt their minds splintering. The familiar walls of the archive seemed to melt and flow, the shelves twisting into grotesque parodies of themselves. The meticulous order he had cherished dissolved into chaos. Memories, once firm and reliable, now flickered like dying embers, their authenticity questioned by the overwhelming presence. He was no longer in the archive, but suspended the archive, usually a bastion of order, now seemed to undulate, the rows of shelves breathing in and out with the pulsing thrum that vibrated through Blake's skull. The light fixtures flickered, not in a mechanical fault, but as if the very illumination struggled to maintain its state. Blake clutched the cold stone, its surface no longer merely cool but an active siphon, drawing warmth, drawing coherence from their being. The words etched into it, previously a source of revelation, now seemed to squirm, rearranging themselves into patterns that held no discernible meaning, yet resonated with an undeniable, terrifying significance. A profound disorientation seized Blake. The familiar scent of old paper and dust was replaced by something metallic, acrid, like ozone mixed with the sharp tang of ancient blood. Blake looked at their own hands, observing the trembling fingers with a detached curiosity. Were these truly their hands? The skin seemed stretched, translucent, revealing a network of veins that pulsed with the same resonant thrum. A distant, internal voice, faint and reedy, whispered that this was wrong, that they were wrong, but the dominant sensation was a strange, compelling clarity, a violent awakening. The archive's walls began to ripple. Not a visual distortion, but a felt one, as if the very air had become thick and viscous. Blake knew, with an absolute certainty that superseded all logic, that staying here was impossible. The stone in their grip pulsed, a silent command, pulling them towards an unseen destination. Blake moved, not with conscious decision, but as if guided by an invisible current. Each step was heavy, yet imbued with an urgency that propelled them through the labyrinthine corridors. The humming grew, a symphony of discord that drowned out the world, replaced it with its own distorted reality. Blake found the exit, the heavy metal door, a temporary barrier against the encroaching chaos. Outside, the city was a smear of light and shadow, muted and distant, as if viewed through a thick pane of warped glass. The compulsion was undeniable, west, towards the rising peaks that pierced the bruised twilight sky. The drive became a blur of motion and fractured perception. Streetlights elongated into pillars of pure light, then dissolved into swirling motes. Buildings leaned and swayed, their concrete forms dissolving into something softer, more organic, before snapping back into rigid geometry. As the city receded, replaced by winding roads that snaked through encroaching wilderness, Blake's grip on the steering wheel tightened. The mountain range loomed, a jagged silhouette against the perpetually bruised sky. The stone in Blake's hand pulsed rhythmically, a silent metronome dictating their path. A profound realization began to surface, not as a thought, but as a felt truth. The horror was not something out there, something that had been uncovered. It was something that had always been here, woven into the very fabric of existence, merely veiled by the fragile construct Blake had once called reality. The artifact was not a key to an external door, but a key to an internal one, unlocking the primordial chaos that resided within their own perception. Blake felt a profound shift, a dissolving of boundaries. Memories surfaced, not as recollections, but as immediate sensations: the feel of ancient stone beneath a different hand, the taste of air from a different age, the sound of a language that had never been spoken by human tongue. These were not Blake's memories, yet they were Blake's, merging and intertwining with their own past, creating a monstrous tapestry of fragmented identities. Blake's personal history, the comforting narrative of their life, began to fray at the edges, unraveling into threads that were rewoven into something vast and alien. The road narrowed, becoming a treacherous path through the mountain pass. Jagged peaks clawed at the sky, their surfaces not merely rock but shifting, breathing entities. Blake pulled the vehicle to a stop at a desolate overlook. Blake stepped out into the biting wind. The world here was different. The sky pulsed with an unnatural luminescence. The stars, or what Blake had always believed were stars, were not pinpricks of light, but gaping wounds in the cosmic fabric, bleeding a sickly, iridescent glow. The mountain pass was not just a geological formation, it was a throat, a maw, perpetually open. Blake looked down at their hands again. They were still their hands, yet they felt borrowed. The face reflected in the vehicle's window was Blake's, but the eyes held a depth of ancient, unblinking awareness that was utterly foreign, utterly terrifying. The humming intensified, no longer just in their head, but resonating from the very core of the mountains, from the churning sky, from the artifact in their grasp. It was the sound of the world dissolving, and of Blake dissolving along with it. The horror was not just outside, it was within. It had always been within. Blake was not merely witnessing the unraveling, Blake was part of the unraveling. Blake clutched the artifact, its surface cool and impossibly smooth against their palm, a silent anchor in the chaos. The object pulsed faintly, a counterpoint to the thrum, and a new understanding, cold and clear, settled in Blake's mind. This wasn't merely an object, it was a key, a beacon, and it was calling them. Blake moved, not with a conscious decision, but as if drawn by an invisible current. The air in the archive grew heavy, thick with an unspoken promise. Each step echoed, not against the tiled floor, but against the resonant frequencies now permeating the space. They walked past the empty desk of a colleague, through the deserted corridors, the building's familiar geometry subtly warping at the edges of their vision. The exit sign glowed with an unnerving intensity, a portal to a world that felt increasingly alien. Outside, the city hummed, a distant, muffled sound. Blake found themselves behind the wheel of their vehicle, the engine starting with a surprising normalcy that felt like a betrayal. The artifact lay on the passenger seat, its faint luminescence casting a pale, shifting light. Blake knew where they had to go, a destination that had been etched into their awareness not through memory, but through an emergent, undeniable certainty. The vehicle sped through the night, the urban sprawl giving way to winding roads, then to the desolate, ascending slopes of the surrounding landscape. The air grew colder, thinner, as Blake climbed higher. The headlamps cut through the encroaching mist, revealing skeletal trees and jagged rock faces. It was not a language, but a pattern of sound, a complex rhythm that Blake's mind, or something deeper within it, began to interpret. Finally, the vehicle reached the summit of the mountain pass. Above, the sky was a canvas of impossible, shifting hues, where stars seemed to swim and coalesce into patterns that defied known constellations. The artifact in their hand pulsed with a furious intensity, its light now a steady, internal glow. Blake walked to the very edge of the pass, the precipice dropping into an unseen chasm. The artifact vibrated violently, its surface growing warm, then hot, against their palm. It was the sound of existence being unmade and remade, of reality being stretched thin, then snapped. Then, the reveal. The artifact wasn't just a key, it was a fragment of a greater consciousness, a sliver of an entity that had always been here, woven into the very structure of the universe, unseen, unheard, until now. It had not been discovered, it had chosen to be found. And Blake, the diligent archivist, was not merely its finder, but its chosen conduit. The lines between self and other blurred, then dissolved entirely. The artifact pulsed one final time, then dissolved into a fine, shimmering dust that drifted into Blake's open mouth, into their eyes, into their very being. A profound silence descended upon the mountain pass. The wind still howled, but its sound was now part of a larger, more intricate symphony that Blake could suddenly comprehend. Their human form remained, but it was no longer merely flesh and bone. It was a vessel, a living conduit for something vast and ancient. Blake felt the boundaries of their mind expand, encompassing not just the mountain pass, but the entire world, the solar system, the galaxy, all at once. They saw the intricate patterns of cosmic dust, the silent dance of nebulae, the slow, inexorable march of entropy. And within it all, the subtle, pervasive influence of the entity, a silent hum beneath the noise of existence. Blake stood on the precipice, their eyes reflecting the impossible light of the cosmos, their former self a distant, fading echo. The archivist was gone, replaced by a new kind of observer, a silent sentinel. The horror had not ended, it had merely found a new form, a new perspective. The world continued to spin, oblivious to the subtle shift, unaware of the new, silent presence that now watched from the mountain pass, a fragment of the cosmic entity, newly awakened, endlessly observing.